In North Africa, the British have been defending their Egyptian holdings, which protect the Suez Canal, from early war attacks by the Italians, by the Italians, from their colony in Libya, through variety of stratagems, basically involving back and forth around the city of Benghazi, which Churchill later calls the Benghazi handicap, sort of like horse racing. What happens is the Italians drive to the end of their supply lines, the British do a flank attack around them, and drive the Italians back, and then the Italians do a flank attack around them and drive the British back, and it's about supplies and it's about the open desert flank. And a lot of the battles happen on the left side of the map near Benghazi and near the Gulf of Sidra here in Italian Libya. When Germany sends Erwin Rommel and the Afrika Korps, a tank army, to lead and aid the Italians, the danger to Egypt and to British interests in the Middle East in general radically increases, because Rommel is probably the second greatest tank commander in the German military, right next to Heinz Guderian. He is aggressive. He's somebody that the British admire in battle. They call him the Desert Fox, and they see him as a chivalrous knight, despite the fact that in his private life he was more pro-Nazi than a lot of people know. In any case, Rommel pushes the British back and forth, but ultimately cracks the back of the British army and drives the British to a choke point here at El Alamein. The first battle of El Alamein is Rommel trying to break through a British defensive position held by British General Auchinleck and not being able to. Now, this is a choke point. El Alamein is a choke point because it's between the Mediterranean Sea to the north and the Qattara Depression to the south. The Qattara Depression is an area of dust and sand and rocks, and it's significantly below the desert. It is difficult to get down to and up from, certainly in the 1940s, and it's basically a barrier to tank armies. You cannot just flank the army by going deeper into the desert because the Qattara Depression will block you. So the British use this as a choke point, and they hold the Germans off in the summer of 1942. Now, what is at stake? Had Rommel been able to break through, and Rommel is going to continue to send supplies here and try to break through, is British control not just of Egypt, but of the Middle East. Thanks to the Balfour Declaration, the British have agreed to a certain amount of settlement of Jews in Palestine, what used to be called and what is now called Israel. The Jews are not welcomed by the local Arabs. In fact, Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, in effect the leader of the Palestinian movement, becomes a personal friend of Hitler's. He raises armies of European Muslims for Hitler, and he and Hitler share their desire to wipe out the Jews entirely. Some claim that Haj Amin al-Husseini gave Hitler the idea of not just exiling them from Europe, but exterminating them. I tend to think that they were kindred spirits in their love of the idea of mass murder. But had the Germans arrived, there would have been a mass uprising of Arabs in Cairo, in Egypt, and throughout the Middle East. And it's entirely likely that the Germans would have been joined by Jew-hating Arabs who were happy enough to throw off the Brits, believing that the Germans were their friends. Remember, in World War I, the Germans fought with Muslims of the Ottoman Empire, and Germany had a better reputation than Britain in certain quarters of the Islamic and the Arab world. So keeping the Germans away from the Nile River and away from Cairo is key, and the British managed to do this. And now it's a question of a race for supplies. On the one hand, you have the Germans who are shipping supplies south through Italy and across to Italian Libya and French Tunisia, which then goes across Italian Libya to here at El Alamein. This is a long supply line. And what the British do is the British control the island of Malta. Malta is the unsinkable aircraft carrier, and believe me, the Germans tried to destroy all life on Malta. From Malta, British air attacks can shoot down Italian and German supply planes, and they can sink Italian ships. Also, Malta is not only a base for aircraft, it's a base for small craft warships that raid into the convoys that the Germans and the Italians send across the Mediterranean. And it's a base for submarines, British submarines, which become expert at sinking Italian and German shipping. So that is the one supply chain of the Germans. On the other hand, you've got the British. And the British have an advantage and a disadvantage. The disadvantage the British have is they're sending their supplies either directly from the Americas or from Britain itself all the way around Africa, up to the Red Sea and over to Egypt. But they've been doing that since the height of the war. In fact, at the height of the Battle of Britain, Churchill orders a tank corps, the only intact tank corps in the British Army with its Matilda tanks, to leave Britain in the face of a German invasion so that they'll be around to Cairo in time to fight in the desert against the Italians and possibly the Germans in order to protect Britain's oil supply. So that's the disadvantage. But the British have been stockpiling supplies in Egypt basically throughout the war. And the advantage the British have is their supply dumps are here in Cairo. So they are much closer to their source of supply if you consider their source of supply to be the Egyptian stockpiles that Britain has been building since the beginning of the war. With those stockpiles, the Germans and the British fight their war of supply, and the British tend to be able to much more easily restock and replenish their armies on the eastern side of this battlefield. So for about 5 or 6 months, there is relative peace on the El Alamein front. A new British commander, Bernard Law Montgomery, is appointed, and he is much more aggressive than Auchinleck before him. And what Montgomery is going to do is he's going to say, to heck with World War II tactics. What I'm going to do is I'm going to launch a good old-fashioned World War I trench attack on the Germans. I'm going to have a massive superiority in manpower and particularly a massive superiority in artillery. And what I'm going to do is, because this is a static battlefield of limited length, I'm going to be able to use artillery against tanks like no one's been able to before me. And Montgomery builds up this methodical battle plan, which is going to play out in the autumn of 1942. I'm going to show you, as an associated clip, a bit of the British movie Desert Victory, which was made just after this battle, about their desert victory at the Second Battle of El Alamein. The basic British battle plan is to fake the Germans out and then launch a real attack in a different spot along the line. They send their pioneers and scouts under a massive artillery barrage. The entire sky lights up with British artillery at the beginning of the battle. It's almost alarming. Hear that alarm in the background? And so you got these guys with like metal detectors that you'd spot with people on the beach, looking for landmines, marking them, and marking safe paths, so that by dawn, the British infantry, the British trucks, and the British tanks have made it through the German minefields and into a position to actually directly attack the Germans. For 3 days and 3 nights, this trench line battle is contended by the British and the Germans. But ultimately, the British superiority in materials, in artillery, in manpower, caused Rommel's army to crumple, and Rommel retreats, and the British will begin a slow, methodical pursuit. El Alamein is a turning point battle. just as the Battle of the Atlantic in 1943 is a turning point, 42-43. Up until 1942-43, the Germans were winning the Battle of the Atlantic. By the middle of 43, that has changed. Up until November of 42, the Germans had the edge and the Italians in the battles in North Africa. After October, November 42, after Second El Alamein, the British and the Americans are going to have an advantage. Now, there is another reason for this, too. After the Second Battle of El Alamein, the Americans and British are going to land at the opposite end of North Africa in Morocco, in French Morocco, in French Algeria, and they're going to start driving towards Rommel's flank in Tunisia. So Germany is, after the Second Battle of El Alamein, is in retreat from Egypt, and from November, a few weeks later, it's going to be in retreat from the Western Mediterranean, all towards Old Carthage, all towards the colony of Tunisia, where they filmed Tatooine scenes in the first Star Wars movie. So, turning point battle. Before that, the Germans and the Italians were on the march. After that, the Allies are going to be. Our next turning point battle is the mother of all battles. It is the costliest single battle in human history, the Battle of Stalingrad.